Welcome to today's program, The Unfinished Work of the Suffrage Movement with Sally Roesch Wagner. My name is Chris Alexander. I'm a librarian at the Saratoga Springs Public Library. We're delighted to be co-sponsoring this program with the League of Women Voters of Saratoga County and with the Saratoga Book Festival. I'd like to give a special thanks to the League of Women Voters for arranging this talk and obtaining grant funding to make this possible. We are grateful to Humanities New York for its support of this program through the National Endowment for the Humanities. At this point, I would ask Linda McKenney to unmute herself. Linda is with the League of Women Voters, and she will be introducing our speaker. Thank you, Linda.
You're welcome. Thank you, Chris. So welcome, everyone. Dr. Sally Roesch Wagner was awarded one of the first doctorates in the country for work in women's suffrage, women's studies, and has taught women's studies courses for 50 years. He currently serves as an adjunct faculty member in the Syracuse University Renee Crown University Honors Program. Dr. Wagner is the founder and executive director of the Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation and Center for Social Justice Dialogue in Fayetteville, New York. I've been there, and I highly recommend a little road trip and a visit. As a major historian of the suffrage movement, Dr. Wagner was active on the national scene during the suffrage centennial year. She appeared on the CNN special report, Women Represented, and has been quoted in a plethora of magazines. Her articles have appeared in the New York Daily News, Ms. Magazine, the National Women's History Alliance newsletter, and National Suffrage Centennial Commission blog. A prolific author, Dr. Wagner's books include The Women's Suffrage Movement, Unfolding a New Intersectional Look at the 19th Century Women's Rights Movement. I don't know, that's not showing up very well, is it? Sorry. And for young readers, that's because I have a green screen. Okay. And for young readers, We Want Equal Rights, How Suffragists Were Influenced by Native American Women. Dr. Wagner was featured in the documentary Without a Whisper, which uncovers the hidden history of the profound influence Indigenous women had on the beginnings of the women's rights movement in the United States. She was just interviewed within this week for the nationally syndicated radio talk show 51%, which is on WAMC and should be available sometime within the next few weeks. I've had the privilege of being enlightened and inspired by Dr. Wagner on several occasions, and I'm so honored to introduce her to you today. We're very grateful to have her here, and we thank you all for joining us as a listening audience. Dr. Sally Roesch Wagner, take it away.
Thank you, Linda. What a fun introduction. And Chris, thank you too for letting me do this talk. I'm actually coming to you from Syracuse, New York. I'm in the center of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy of the Onondaga Nation, the original homelands of the Onondaga Nation. And that's a good place to begin. And with Linda, you mentioning the film Without a Whisper, I think as we look at what is the unfinished business of the suffrage movement, the place I begin is the place where I live. The land that I live on, and if you're in New York State, you're in the same boat that I'm in. We are on a land where women have had political voice for 1,000 years. Women's suffrage or women's rights don't begin when European settlers arrived. And the reality that we live among women who have had political voice for 1,000 years, while we in the United States of America are celebrating 100 years of our right to vote, presumably guaranteed in the Constitution, I think it's sobering to think about if somebody has 1,000 years experience and you have 100 years experience, is it possible you might learn something from them? And I think that if we look to Indigenous women as the leaders for where we need to go in the 21st century, if we are to save life on the planet, and if we are to create democracy in the United States of America for the first time, we have mentors among us. And so I speak humbly as someone who is not the real spokesperson. If you want to know the real story, you listen to Haudenosaunee women and you listen to Indigenous women generally, because they have not only a track record of women's rights, they have a track record of living in harmony with all life on the planet and recognizing that Mother Earth is the mother of us all. And that if we mess with her, you don't want to mess with Mama, because Mama is going to come back and get you. And we've been messing with Mother Earth far too long. Being present with women and men who have a history that goes well beyond 1,000 years, of recognizing that life is not a hierarchy of God at the top, then man, then woman, then animals, and dirt is the lowest thing, who live in a world in which dirt is on top. Dirt is the most spiritual. Mother Earth is the most spiritual. And we live in a circle, not in a hierarchy. I look across the circle at bees because you know what? If they disappear, so do I. The reality, both scientifically and spiritually, is that we really are all one, and we really are all made of stardust, and we really are interdependent. That reality has missed us in the Western world, and we have acted with the arrogance that we can do anything that we want to anything on this planet. And if we continue with this mindset, life on the planet will end. And we know that now. So that's the sermon to begin. But I think, what are some of the other lessons that we have to learn from the suffrage movement that can tell us what we need to be doing in this moment? Well, I think, first of all, we need to understand that the suffrage movement was not just about the vote. In 1850, national women's rights organizing began with the 1850 Worcester Convention. And during that decade, before the Civil War, every issue that we continue to raise today was brought forth, discussed thoroughly, and solutions were proposed. Let me give you an example. Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who, if you don't know her, you need to know her. She's the woman who Gloria Steinem said is the woman who is ahead of the women who are ahead of their time. I'm not going to talk a lot about her, but Google her and you'll agree with me and Gloria, I think. But Matilda Joslyn Gage said, women are the great unpaid laborers of the world. And everywhere in the world, she said, women make 1/3 to 1/2 the wages that men make. That was 150 years ago. Where are we today? 78%. And for women of color, it's infinitely less than that. You know, we work virtually unpaid until April to make the same amount of money that men make in a year. We don't see equal pay on the immediate horizon. But if we think about, we've only come 25% in 150 years. You give a kid the math problem and they're going to say another 150 years before we get pay equity. Well, what we know, of course, is that's not the answer. The answer is we get the right people in Congress who are going to vote for pay equity and make it mandatory. And then that 25 cents that we're basically putting in the pocket of our employer will come back to us. So, equal pay for equal work. What else? Let me give you the words of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, the two most progressive women, I think, generally in the women's rights movement of the 19th century. And I prefer to call it a women's rights movement because if we say just suffrage, we think just the vote. So let's think women's rights. They said, Stanton and Gage, every child born has the sacred right to be wanted and chosen. Every unborn child has rights, and the most sacred of that is the right to be chosen and wanted. Their vision was that there will never be a child born on this earth that the mother has not welcomed, wanted, and chosen this child. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was called a free lover. And if she said, that was a dirty word in the 19th century, she said, if by free lover you mean someone who believes that a woman should give her body to the one she loves and no other. She's speaking about the absence of rape. She's speaking about the absence of marital rape, because marital rape was legal in this country until the 1980s, and the second wave of feminism began to change the law that was based on the 19th century idea, based on the 18th century idea that once a woman married, she became dead in the law. She became the property of her husband. She ceased to exist legally. This goes all the way back to canon law. It goes all the way back to Genesis. Because of the sin of Eve, woman is to be under the authority of man. You translate that into law, and it becomes a woman ceases to exist legally. And that meant she had no right to her body. She had no right to the children that she bore. A husband in the state of New York could will away an unborn child. That child is born, he has died. The child is ripped from the mother's arms and given to its rightful owner. Rape laws read an act of unlawful sexual intercourse with someone other than the wife of the perpetrator. In other words, doesn't matter the conditions, doesn't matter the force. Your husband, up until the 1980s and the second wave of feminism, your husband had the right to rape you. Under what conditions you could be separated, his body, your body, belonged to him. So the first part of Stanton's quote relates to that a woman should be able to give her love to and make love to the one she loves and no other. And then she said, and a woman should be free to birth or not, depending upon her judgment, her conscience, and her desire. And finally, she said, if you mean by free lover that a woman should be the absolute sovereign of her own body, then indeed, I am a free lover. Stanton and Gage said the most sacred right of all is the right to be chosen and wanted. And the only way you can ensure that every child born is welcomed onto this earth is that a woman alone makes the decision about whether or not she will birth. That was part of the women's suffrage movement on the part of the most progressive of the women. So how did that play out? Well, Actually, I like to think, maybe I'm wrong, but my conclusion is that there was another act in the 19th century that was far more important to women than the vote. And that was this. A religious conservative named Anthony Comstock was able to get legislation passed, making him the press censor of the United States of America. He was able to determine what was obscene in the country. He alone, Anthony Comstock. He arrested thousands of people. People committed suicide. People ended up in prison for years. What did he go after most of all? Anything related to reproduction became illegal. And states passed Comstock Acts after Congress did. And even though forms of birth control were available as early as the 1850s. Let me give you examples. I found a manual written by a doctor in, I believe it was 1826. And in it, he describes a cervical cap, much more discreet than any other kind of birth control. Of that form, safe, effective, especially if used with a spermicide. He also describes a today sponge. Do you remember? I don't know if any of you watched Seinfeld, but do you remember when Elaine was determining whether a man was sponge worthy or today whatever it was, the today sponge I think it was called. Description of that in 1826. Condoms were available. So safe, effective forms of birth control were available by 1850. And for 100 years, women did not have access to determining whether or not they would bring children into the world. And why? Because of the religious right, because of Anthony Comstock. The technology was there, but when birth control pills came on the scene from the pharmaceutical industry in the 1960s, we all believed it was, whoa, for the first time, the media made it clear to us, first time in the history of the world, women can be in control of reproduction. 100 years too late. I want to read you one of the things from my anthology that Linda kindly referred to, the women's suffrage movement. My friend Gloria Steinem did a foreword to it, which I'm very proud of. This is a woman named Ida Craddock. And in 1902, she was arrested under the Comstock Acts for writing and publishing a birth control manual. The judge had indicated he was going to throw the book at her. And Comstock said, once you get out of prison, you did a second book, and I'm going to arrest you for that book. The night before she was going to be sentenced to prison, she killed herself. And I want to read you part of the letter that Ida Craddock left us. She said, I earnestly hope that the American public will awaken to a sense of the danger which threatens it from Comstockism, and that it will demand that Mr. Comstock shall no longer be permitted to suppress works on sexology. The American people have a right to seek and to obtain knowledge upon right living in the marriage relation, either orally or in print, without molestation by this paid informer, Anthony Comstock, or by anybody else. She may have been the first martyr to reproductive justice in the country. So, a couple of issues that were raised by the 19th century women's rights advocates. I want to raise the final question that I'd like us to think about, and that is the issue of voter suppression that we currently face in devastating ways today, with the Georgia law that was recently passed and the laws that other states are passing. How did that start? Well, it started right after the Civil War. There was an attempt to stop African American men from voting when they were guaranteed the vote, presumably, by the 15th Amendment. Women, it was hoped, by the Equal Rights Society, it was the abolitionists and women's rights advocates coming together, and they worked for universal suffrage. We could have had women's vote in 1870. But the Republicans, the radical Republicans, they were called, who were in charge of Congress, said, we can't do it. It's going to be too much. We're going to have to push women aside, and we'll give African American men the vote. And then, of course, with the 14th Amendment, they wrote women out of the Constitution for the first time, defining males only as citizens. Up until that point, the Constitution was gender free. It didn't recognize male or female. But with the 14th Amendment, it did. So women got set back after the Civil War. What happened after that is that there was a break between African Americans and women. You divide and conquer, and that's what happened in that moment. But it wasn't complete. It was made complete after 1890 when Susan B. Anthony and Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony saw the vote as an end in itself. She wanted women to get the vote, believing that if we can get the vote, we'll take care of all the other issues. So don't work on anything else right now. Just work to get women the vote. The other strategy that the organization that she brought together, two women's organizations, two suffrage organizations, came together in a merger in 1890. And it really was a creation of a conservative women's movement, and one that was states' rights led, that was top down leadership. And as it developed between 1890 and 1920, it became increasingly more and more conservative. One of the things that it did eventually was to make a decision that if women were to get the vote, if they were to get states to ratify the constitutional amendment of women's suffrage, women's vote, they would have to appeal to the South. Now, was it inevitable? No. African American men had the vote, immigrant men had the vote. They could have made an alliance with the other outliers, with the other groups that were being oppressed, but they didn't. They chose to appeal to the South. And they did that in this way. They made the argument, give women the vote, because it's a way to maintain white supremacy. There are more white women than there are Negroes, and even there's more white women than there are immigrants. So it's a way not just to maintain white supremacy, but it's a way to maintain native-born supremacy, because this was the largest influx of immigrants into the country between 1890 and 1920 has ever happened. So they used racism as policy. They also allowed each of the state auxiliaries to the National American Woman Suffrage Association to practice whatever they wanted to do. They could segregate if they wanted, and some did. They could work for the vote for white women only, and some did. And finally, they could work for voter suppression to keep African Americans from voting, and some did. Now, what was the result of their basically throwing women of color under the bus? and really working for the vote to be insured for white women. The result of it, in my evaluation, is that they won the battle, but they lost the war for justice. They lost the war for democracy. And that it's certainly not completely their fault that we have voter suppression today. The result of not pushing for the vote in practice for all women was that African American women and men really didn't get the vote until the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And one of the things that I think about a lot is when I hear the magnificence of the African American women that are moving into leadership positions, and I don't have to name names, you bring them into your own head when I say that. When I think of how powerful their voices are and how strong their leadership is and how wise their direction is, I think about how incalculable the loss is of their voices for all those years when they had no political voice. Asian women didn't really get the vote, and men, until the 20th century. And Native American women and men until 1924 with the Voting Rights Act. Now, the traditional women and men of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy don't vote in New York or United States elections. They're sovereign nations, and they will accept citizenship only in their own nations. But there are a number of other Native nations that accept dual citizenship in the United States and in their own nations. I think one of the things I've heard them say is, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so believing that they have more sort of voice if they are at the table. Not until 1924. So the legacy of the women's suffrage movement that we must take accountability for is a legacy also of voter suppression. What do we do about that? Pretty clear, pretty obvious. We have to work in every single way we can, every moment we can, to ensure that every single person in this country has a political voice. Because if we lose that, we lose democracy. We still haven't created it. Democracy is a wonderful vision, and either we work toward it or we work against it. And in this moment, we are chosen by history to have the gift of bringing democracy forward. Let's do it. So let's open this up now to questions and comments. And Linda, will you take it away?
There aren't any questions in the chat right now, but I actually had one. When you were talking about birth control, the logical part of my brain, if I were a man, could be, so I won't have so many dependents. I won't have so many mouths to feed. Do you think it was simply religion that got in the way, or just, the message? Why wouldn't men sort of embrace? Do you have an opinion on that? Embrace birth control?
That's an interesting thought. I think that, well, there are a number of men today who are strongly in favor of reproductive justice. And I think I like to use the term reproductive justice because we need to talk also about the forced sterilization of women of color.
Yeah.
What we found out in reports that were issued in the 1970s was that Native American women were sterilized, in some cases, almost every childbearing age woman in some native nations had been forcibly sterilized without her knowledge or consent. And regulations were put in place to stop that. African American women were forcibly sterilized. It's part of the legacy of our country. So if we're talking about reproductive justice, it's the right to birth as well as the right to choose not to birth. It's a matter of choice. And that choice, our founding foremothers said, has to be in the hands of women. The reason that I point out the church as the source of that is that it really is the Catholic Church and the evangelical churches today that are the opponents of any form of uh, interference with reproduction, shall we say. The Catholic Church does endorse the natural form of birth control that you regulate your period and determine when you're pregnant. So Comstock really was a representative of the Young Men's Christian Association. And he was operating solely on religious grounds in making his argument.
Okay. I know there was a lot of true scientific beliefs people had back then, and in a variety of ways regarding women in general and their capacities and such.
Well, in terms of men, I think we also need to to acknowledge the role of the American Medical Association,
Yes.
which also opposed any, birthing was good for business, so they didn't stop.
So we do have a question here. What was the relationship of the WCTU and the women's rights movement?
Oh, I will channel Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Frances Willard, the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, is the most dangerous woman in America. And why did she make this argument? Because the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, not only wanted to get rid of the use of alcohol and tobacco, completely outlawed in the United States. I don't think that was Matilda's biggest concern, although she did like a medicinal glass of wine, I have found. But the big concern was that part of their platform was to place God in the Constitution, Jesus Christ as the head of the government, and prayer in the public schools, mandatory prayer in the public schools, and to create a Christian nation. Now, what that would mean is, do we really know what Christ said or felt about abortion? No, we don't have a clue. We don't have a clue what he thought about homosexuality, and there are Christians who will say, and the a religious coalition for reproductive rights lets us know that a majority of Christian denominations believe that abortion may be the most moral decision in some instances. And so you have this division among Christians. You have, some Christian denominations where, gay marriage is just a given. And then you have the Catholic Church, which just last week reaffirmed that it is a sin, that you love the homosexual, but it's a sin and you can't marry them. So, who's going to decide if you have Jesus Christ as the head of the government? Which Jesus Christ is going to stand up and tell you what you got to do? It's creation of chaos. But worse than that, if you create a Christian nation, then if you don't pledge allegiance to whatever form of Jesus Christ is the going one, you won't be able to vote won't be able to run for public office. I mean, who does that exclude? Let's face it. So Gage saw that as the greatest danger of the hour. Susan B. Anthony, on the other hand, saw Frances Willard as leading the largest contingent of women in the United States. It was like 10 times stronger than the women's suffrage movement. And so she invited Frances Willard into the organized women's movement after that merger in 1890. And that's part of the reason that the movement became more and more conservative. Ultimately, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton edited the Woman's Bible, she had been elected as the first president. But in 1895, she issued the first edition of her Woman's Bible. And Gage was part of that. There was a revising committee that went through the Bible and just analyzed different sections of it relating to women. But as Stanton said, clergy danced like parched peas on a hot stove. And, she has one of the best lines. When the people accused, I think ministers said, this book is the work of the devil himself. And Stanton calmly replied, no, there was not a single man on the revising committee. So, she knew how to take them out. But I think when her Woman's Bible came out, even though she was the original president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the organization basically denounced the book. And they'd never denounced anything that Frances Willard wrote, but they totally dissociated themselves from the Woman's Bible.
Yeah. All right, next up. Would you tell us more about the governance of Indigenous nations in the past and how women were included?
It's not past tense, still going on today. I'll share a little personal story. So when the 45th president was in the White House, I was challenged by Klan mothers repeatedly. Why do you allow that man to continue in office? We would take him out in a moment. And what they meant was that the Klan mother has the responsibility, and has for at least 1,000 years, had the responsibility to nominate the chief. When the chief dies, the symbol of his authority is returned to the Klan mother because she holds that position. And she's watched the boys grow up. She knows who, when they're playing lacrosse, they play as a team player. They don't play for their own glory. She's watched the boy who sits back and looks to see what other people need. And she watches that boy as he grows up, and she sees he is chief material. That's the material that a leader is made of, and not somebody who puts themselves forward. And so she grooms him. And when the old chief passes, she says to first the women, and then I think everyone in the Klan, this is the one that I'm thinking about putting in the position. Does anybody have any objections? I don't know exactly how this works. Look, I'm an outsider. I'm giving you the best a white woman can give, at least this white woman can give you. If you want the real story, you talk to Haudenosaunee women. They're the authorities, the Klan mothers who are doing this, but this is the best I understand it. So then, if there are no objections, she places him in position. And they're equally really balanced in terms of their work. I've heard it described as she's the eyes and the ears of the people. She hears what they need. She sees what they're talking about and what they want. And she gives that then to the chief, and he needs to listen to her because he's listening to the voice of the people. And then he becomes the voice, but the balance is needed, and it's there. There are three, this is what I've heard from different clan mothers and have read. Three sort of absolutes. One is that he cannot have committed a murder. Traditionally, if he was a warrior, he had to step down because it's a peace confederacy. And he can't have committed a theft. If he's ever stolen anything, he won't be considered. And finally, he cannot have abused a woman. And so if he is ever found to have done that, his clan mother would take him out because she has the responsibility. I used to talk about it as she has the right, but for Haudenosaunee women, they see it as a responsibility to remove the chief if necessary. Every decision he makes has to be made for the seventh generation to come. Think about what if our leadership had that requirement? If fracking would be out the window in a minute, and you would go on and on and on and talk about what would not even be considered if you think of the seventh generation. So that's basically the the role of the clan mother. She also has the final decisions in issues of war and peace. If you know, in the old days, the if there was a thought about should we go to war, because she births the boys that would go to war, the men that would go to war. It's her responsibility to decide. She also the final decision about the land, and makes you wonder if um, that was followed through and respected by the U.S. government. What would the result of that be? And she also names the children. She has other responsibilities. Um, I guess I've heard it called the bag of names. And when someone passes, um, their name goes back to the clan mother, and the name never dies. The name never is gone. It passes from one person to the other. And so the name that Matilda Jocelyn Gage was given when she received an honorary adoption into the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation, that name is in use in Akwesasne today. A Mohawk uh, Wolf Clan woman carries that name.
Wow. Wow, the whole seventh generation thing is pretty profound to think
Well,
about.
and here's a little aside. When the Sullivan Clinton campaign came through with scorched earth policy, George Washington's orders, General Washington's orders, were to destroy everything living in Haudenosaunee land. There wasn't money enough to pay the soldiers, and so they wanted to pay them in land. And the way you did that was you got rid of the native people that were on the land. So it was a scorched earth policy. And so George Washington was given the name Village Destroyer. And because the name continues to be that position, every clan chief or sachem carries the name of that position. So the President of the United States carries the name of that was given to George Washington. And the name of the President of the United States is Village Destroyer.
Wow, that's interesting. Well, next up is we're going back to the suffrage movement. When choosing the strategy of siding with the South and securing the vote for women, were any voices raised loudly in opposition from within or without the women's movement?
Yes. African American women, and the way they did this was just so amazing. At one point, when the meeting, the national convention was held in, I think it was New Orleans, they invited the leadership, the white women's leadership, to meet with them. I don't know what happened in that meeting, but it was, you know, they tried to engage. They tried to um, Ask them to see. One of the letters that I have in the documents in the women's suffrage movement, I won't dig for it now, I'll just paraphrase it. But it is a letter that Frederick Douglass's widow, he married, his first wife was African American, his second wife was white. And she attended the National American Women's Suffrage Convention in 1900. And she writes to a friend and says, the colored women do not like Miss Anthony. She was president of the National American at that point. And she said, I sat through that convention and heard 3 times a delegate from the South call for white supremacy. And there was no attempt to stop her. So they knew what they were doing. They well knew what they were doing. They made a choice. Also, I have in here an excerpt from Ida B. Wells' autobiography. Ida B. Wells was an African American who was primarily known for her outstanding and courageous work against lynching, which was the ultimate form of voter suppression in the South. The women's suffrage movement never took a stand and supported Wells in her work. There would have been lives saved if they had, just as there will be lives saved today if we feminists join with Black Lives Matter. So, Ida B. Wells, in her autobiography, talks about how Susan B. Anthony practices interrupting racism as a good ally personally. And she gives a couple experiences of that. One is when Wells is speaking at a meeting and she gets really hassled by a white racist guy, and Anthony comes to her defense. Another one is when Ida B. Wells is staying with Anthony in her home in Rochester. And Anthony is going out for the day. She doesn't need her secretary. So she tells her secretary to help Wells, who has correspondence she needs to get out. And Anthony leaves. She comes back a little bit later and her secretary is leaving. And Anthony says, are you done with your work with Ida? And the secretary says she wouldn't work with her. And Anthony fired her on the spot. Ida B. Wells points to those 2 instances and then says, but when she tried to convince me of the need for expediency, in other words, practicing racism as policy in order to win the Southern vote, basically Wells says she lost me. I wouldn't. But that's sort of that brilliance of engagement that African American women did and do. There's another form of leadership that we, can sit back. Those of us of the settler colonialist white tradition can sit back and watch. Wow, that's how you do it. That's the way you do it. It's a long legacy of that really strategic engagement that they've had to do to survive and learn to survive.
Yeah. Well, this is something I was not aware of, this next question. How widespread is the view that was expressed at the 2016 presidential convention that a family should have only one vote? Thus, if a husband and wife disagree, only the husband's opinion counts.
Well, wait a minute. 2016?
That's what this says.
I never heard.
I have not heard that myself. I mean, I can guess what your response would be.
I can guess who would have said that. Love to know. Republican convention. Interesting.
Well, it doesn't. It just says the presidential convention. So
remove the vote from women. back to the two become one and the one is the man.
Yes, I've heard that expression. Wow. So
Uh,
it's not widespread enough that you've heard that.
no,
Okay.
smoke would have been coming out of my ears. It is now. Thanks for sharing us that information. No, I think it's, it is important to know your enemy. It is.
Yes, yes. There's that expression, what? Keep your enemies closer than your friends, something like that. Just you need to know what's going on.
Yeah.
Linda, there's one other question we missed. It says
Oh,
one of the other issues the suffragists cared about was child labor laws. What would you say is the current unfinished work in this area?
thanks, Chris. I scrolled
Oh,
down too fast.
that's a really good question. And I would leave that to someone who is more knowledgeable than I am about that. I honor questions like that because they point out to me my ignorance and they give me research that I really need to do. So I thank you for the question. One of the things I would just say is historically what was going on was that children, 10 and 12 years old were working in unsafe conditions, long hours, and there was no protection. Related to that was also the protection of female children with age of consent laws. In Vermont, I believe it was the age of consent in the latter half of the 19th century was 7 years old. In other words, if a man has sexual intercourse with a 7-year old, his defense would be it was a consensual act. And so the sexual violation of children was actually embedded in law. So the rights of children generally were a major issue of the movement.
Wow.
Getting those age of consent laws,
Hmm.
the ages raised was
Hmm.
an important
Hmm.
issue.
And finally, whoops, nope, not finally, but has anyone besides you
Oh,
unearthed the brilliance of Matilda Jocelyn Gage?
Abby Johnson. Did you see the chat that just came up? Abby Johnson, the person who
Oh,
did this single.
oh, okay, yep, yep.
Could you read that?
Abby Johnson, it's RNC speaker, was at the Republican convention. Anti-abortion activities supported household voting, with the husbands having the final say.
Wow.
Thank you.
I
That's
mean,
good
when
to
you
know.
there was an assumption way back when that wasn't that women would vote whatever way the husband voted. I mean, back when we were trying to get the vote, that don't worry about it because your wife will vote however you wish her to vote. Seems like I read that somewhere.
Yeah, yep. That was an
Okay.
argument. I'm sorry I interrupted the
So,
next
yep, that's
question.
okay. So, has anyone besides you unearthed the brilliance of Matilda Jocelyn Gage, and why is that? Is it? I don't know if it's why you've sort of gravitated toward her, or why no one else has unearthed her brilliance.
Well, I was the first, but I am not the last. She's become well known in mainstream now, I think. And if someone writes a suffrage history and doesn't include Gage, they get called on it. But her papers were in South Dakota in a private collection of her granddaughter. Her granddaughter was a friend of my mother's, and through that connection,
Ah,
I
wow.
discovered, like Columbus, Jocelyn Gage. But she really was written out deliberately. Susan B. Anthony was a big part of that. Wanted just Stanton and Anthony to be remembered as the leaders, and so there's a whole series of ways in which she, and then of course as the movement became more conservative, supports treaty rights and native sovereignty, who calls out the church as the source of women's oppression, who exposes that Catholic priests are sexually abusing children and women, who described sex trafficking in the United States in 1893, who, I could go on. And she writes about the superior civilization and culture of indigenous nations. You're practicing racism as policy. You're appealing to Christian conservatives. You don't want this woman to be on your team. And so they take her off the team posthumously. So we're writing her back into history, as many, many women who were written out are being written back. I'll just point out one book that I have right now that I'm reading right on my table. This is an example. Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement. Kathleen Cahill. There's book after book like this that are coming out now where queering the women's suffrage movement, bringing forth the lesbians who were critical in the women's suffrage movement. We're repopulating history. Mary Baird coined that term, and that's exactly the business we're about. And we won't know who we are until we really have all the stories.
That's so true.
We're beginning to know who we are.
Yeah. Is the center in Fayetteville open now, or?
Thank you for that question. And now to our commercial message. The Matilda Jocelyn Gage Foundation is open now for tours, small and individual visitors groups, by appointment. So please go on our website, MatildaJocelynGage.org.
But as I said, I love that visit there. There's so much information. It's definitely worth it. It's not that far away.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yep, you're welcome.
And also, I might just add that her major work, Woman, Church, and State, this is a form of it that's currently out of print, but Woman, singular, Church, and State is online and searchable, and it also is available in print form through our gift shop, along with a number of other Gage's writings if people want to know more about Gage.
Okay, I think we've come. Okay, I think we've come to the end of our questions. I want to give you great thanks. Thank you to the League. Thank you to the Saratoga Book Festival for also being our sponsor today, and to the National Endowment for the Humanities for making this possible. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for joining me this afternoon. Enjoy.